Now we're going to focus on modeling windows. This is the result we are after, and each window will have the option of how high you want to raise the lower window to open, so we can have some uniqueness to each window around the building. You will also have a choice to have a low poly version of this window before we add extra detail. We are only going to create the single window and the small window, and then we'll duplicate the single window to create the double window. Also, in the next video, we will UV these windows before duplicating them around the building, so this way we'll only have to UV these objects once, and they will also share the same UV space. So our focus right now is to model the single window and model the small window. Let's begin. We're going to start with a single window, and we need to extract an existing face where the window will go. We can either use the front face where the double window is going to go, or the single window face on the side. It doesn't really matter, and I'm going to use the one in the front. So select the face you want to extract, go to Edit Mesh, and choose Extract. This will make that face its own separate object. It will make it easier for us to model our window, and I will attach the windows back to the building. Let's move the face forward, and we need to modify the pivot point on this object, on this single face. When you extract geometry, it repositions the pivot point back at the world origin. So I'm going to select this face, this object, hold D, then C, middle mouse click and drag along an edge, all the way down to vertex. With this object still selected, press Ctrl 1. This will isolate select, meaning that whatever is selected will be in view and everything else will become hidden. This is a great shortcut to focus on what you're working on and hide everything else from view. Now we're only going to model the single window, and I will duplicate it to create the double window. So we need to split this face exactly down the middle and remove that other face, other side. It would be probably easier to start with a single face for the single window we had on the side. But we're here. So let's go to Insert Edge Loop Tool Options. I have it on my custom tool shelf, and if you double click on the icon in your tool shelf, it will bring up the options. Enable multiple edge loops, use equal multiplier, and set number of edge loops to 1. Then insert one vertically and one horizontally. Both of them will be inserted exactly in the middle of the object. I also like to reset this tool back to default. Then let's take the other side and delete the two faces. And now we're just left with the single window. We have the top and the bottom face to begin modeling the window. Now select both faces and press Ctrl E. Turn off, keep faces together, and use offset at 4. This will create the exterior borders. Then let's select the top face, press Ctrl E, and set thickness to -2. Now select the bottom face, Ctrl E again, and set thickness to -3. The way I picked these values is based on experience working with similar objects. So you might have to try out different offset, different thickness values to see what works for the type of building you are creating. So this object right now could be your low poly window. If you wanted to save on some polygons, you could use this and call it done. We're going to take this a step further and add more detail, but you could use this. I'm going to move the window back temporarily into the window frame to see how everything is lining up. And I'm also going to duplicate it to see how the double window will look. And everything is looking good. I'm going to delete the duplicated copy and delete history on this object. Now let's begin to add some detail. We want this window, the bottom half, to have the ability for us to control how high we raise that window. This way we'll have some variety and uniqueness to each window, because some of the windows will be open and others will have an AC unit sticking out of them. So each window will be somewhat unique. So let's select the bottom face and extract it. Hold Shift, right click hold, and choose Extract Faces. Now let's modify the pivot point. And I actually want this pivot point to be aligned to the front bottom corner of the window frame. Isolate select this face, Ctrl 1, And this will be our bottom part of the window, which we will be able to raise up and down. So select the front face and press Ctrl E. I've set this to 2, and when we do this, it creates an additional face in the back. So we want to go ahead and delete that. So we want to make sure that we only delete that single face it creates in the back. So I'm going to select it and delete. Now select the inner face, Ctrl E to extrude, and set thickness to -2. Let's go ahead and bring the window back and take a look within the context of the bottom window and the window frame. We're going to move it up and down to see if anything's overlapping. And it's looking good. Let's increase the bottom portion of the frame so it's a bit thicker. I'm going to switch over to front view, vertice mode, and just move these vertices up. And I like to keep everything snapped to the grid when I'm working with architectural geometry. So this is just my personal pet peeve. I'm going to switch over to grid spacing of 1 and snap these vertices to the grid. You don't have to do this, you can just raise the geometry up. But I just really like staying on the grid, for no other reason that it just makes me happy. Let's go ahead and bring back the main window. And when we raise this bottom part up when it's open, we have no thickness. So we need to add some additional geometry to the bottom window. Switch over to Edge Component mode. Double click on the border edge to select the entire edge loop. Then press Ctrl E and set thickness to -2. This creates that additional geometry for our border. So we have some thickness to our window. Let's bring back our main window, our main frame. And because we extracted the face, it resets our border edges and back face column to default. So let's go back to custom polygon display and re-enable that. So this is coming along nicely. Let's go ahead and modify a pivot point of the bottom part for the bottom window to be aligned in the corner of the main frame. Since these are essentially going to be the same object, moving them around is easier when both of the pivot points are in the exact same location. So I'm just going to select the bottom part of the window and modify it to be at the bottom left vertex of the main window. Now let's select both of them and move them back into the window frame of the building to see how it looks within the context of our main mesh. Let's reset our grid back to 10 and take a look. I'm gonna move the window up and down, and I think it's looking very good. Our next step is we need to add some additional geometry for the interior of the window, meaning that when we raise this window, we don't have anything on the inside. No window sill, no interior frame. So basically we don't have substantial geometry that looks like a window frame. I'm going to temporarily delete where the glass would be, these 2 polygons. This will give us a better way to check what we're modeling and which geometry we need to model. I'm also going to turn off back face column so it's easier to extrude edges and align our interior frame geometry. Let's switch to Edge Component mode, select the bottom edge, and extrude it to create the window sill. I'm going to also do this for the sides and extrude 2 small side polygons so the window sill is aligned on each side to the outer edge frame. Now I'm going to select these 2 edges, hold Shift, left click drag and extrude the sides of the inner frame just to the halfway point of the window. We are now beginning to have some interior geometry, and it's beginning to look like a real window frame. Then let's go ahead and continue to extrude all the way up. The reason we did it twice is because we're going to need to fill in this tiny little gap right here. If the player happens to see or catch a glimpse of that gap, so we don't want to ruin that illusion. And the reason we have that gap is because if you remember, we extruded the top face with thickness set to -2 and the bottom face was extruded with thickness of -3. So for this we have a small tiny little gap. And the player might not even see that small gap in geometry, especially when they're on the first floor looking up at the windows at a certain angle. But we do want to avoid it just in case, because we don't want to come back and have to fix it. So let's select the 2 edges, these 2 edges right here, and extrude them to close that gap. without having the vertices or the edges overlap with the front of the window. So we want to move them close enough, or in my case, I snapped them to the grid, but made sure that it did not touch the front window edge. So now if we take a look from the same angle, we successfully closed that gap. Now let's create the face at the top. I'm gonna select these two edges, then go to Edit Mesh and choose Bridge. This will create a face and bridge between two selected edges. Let's do the same thing for the small edge next to it. Select the two edges and press G to repeat last used command. We want to re-enable back face culling, and the faces in the back that we cannot see, we're not going to recreate them because the player will never see them, and we made sure to only create faces that a player will see. So now if we go ahead and raise this bottom window up, here we have the window sill, geometry for the side frame, and the top frame. Let's recreate the window glass. Switch over to Edge Component Mode, select two edges, and Bridge. I'm going to hold Shift, right click, hold, and you could either choose Fill Hole or Bridge. And I'm going to use Bridge. And I'm going to do the same thing for the top window glass. Let's bring the building back. And here's what we have so far. The single window is now done. We're going to use the same window to create the double window. But we're not going to do that yet because we need to UV the single window first, and then we'll be able to duplicate it, saving us some work. Now we're going to focus on creating the small window. We will pretty much repeat exact same steps we just went through. Let's select the face and extract it, and modify the pivot to be in the bottom corner of the object. I'm going to press Ctrl 1 to isolate select. Isolate select can also be found in the viewport toolbar, right here. Go to Insert Edge Loop Tool Options. Change the settings as we did before so we can insert one edge loop exactly in the middle of the face. Select both faces, press Ctrl E, turn off, keep faces together, and change offset to 3. This creates the exterior borders for the windows. Now select the top inner face, press Ctrl E, and set thickness to -2. And select the bottom face, Ctrl E, and set thickness to -3. Again, the reason we are setting -3 for the bottom and -2 for the top is that when we extract the bottom window and it's moved up, it won't overlap with the top window. So that one unit gives us enough space for the geometry not to overlap. Here is the very low poly version. If you wanted to use this, you can. But we're going to take it a step further. So let's continue. Let's do some minor aesthetic tweaks. I'm going to select the inner vertices and scale them in order to reduce the size of that border. Then I'm going to move these vertices up. The reason I'm doing this is to offset the size difference between the top and the bottom window. When we extract the bottom window to make it movable, we will create an inner border. That inner border will shrink the window size, making it smaller. So by moving these vertices up, it makes the top and the bottom window similar in size. Here I switched over to side view, and I'm changing the view along axis so I can see these vertices better, and then I'm aligning these vertices to the grid, making sure that they equal in about 4 units in thickness for that border. I am doing these adjustments ahead of time because I am anticipating problems. I already know what's going to happen when I begin to adjust the top and the bottom window by extracting the bottom, and this comes from modeling experience. I've already done similar objects like this before, and I know what's going to happen and what I will need to adjust. So I'm doing it ahead of time to save me time. And your ability to anticipate ahead of time all the issues that you may encounter so you don't have to redo your object or adjust it as you go along will come from modeling similar objects and experience. Now let's go ahead and select this face, extract it, and modify the pivot. Then again, switch over to Face Component Mode, select the face, and press Ctrl E. Change Offset to 2 to create the exterior border for the window. Now this will create that back face that we need to delete. So go behind the object, make sure you select it. It will overlap all the other geometry, and just delete it. I'm not quite sure why that face gets created when you are offsetting, but just be aware that it happens in 2018 and it might happen in some other versions. And remove it. Now select this face, press Ctrl E to extrude, and set thickness to -2. We now have our movable window. We can move it up and down, and it's not overlapping with any other geometry. Select both objects and delete history. Let's create the inner window frame, and then we'll add thickness to our movable window. Let's go ahead and select our windows, Ctrl 1 to isolate select, and actually I just want the main window frame. Switch over to edge component mode, and extrude the bottom edge for the window sill. Going to change grid spacing back to 10, so I can align and snap this edge at 10 units. Select the side edges, extrude them, snap them to the grid. Both will align to the side of the frame, and then select those edges again and extrude them up to a halfway point. Let's extrude again, snapping them all the way up to the top of the window frame, then selecting the inner edges in order to hide the gap by extruding those edges. Gonna need to change the grid spacing to 1 so I can snap on the grid but not overlapping the front edge of the window frame. Again, essentially we are repeating the exact same steps we did for the single window. Select the two edges at the top, bridge them, and do the same thing for the smaller two edges next to it. I'm gonna temporarily delete this face, take a look, and the gap is covered but the bottom vertices are too high. Let's adjust them. Select the vertices on both sides and move them down. And let's check this from all different angles to make sure that we cannot see the open border edges. Geometry is cheap, so if you wanted to make sure to avoid any areas of your objects where there's an open face border, just go ahead and fill it with a polygon. But I wanted to make sure not to create any geometry where the player will not see it. Let's bridge the edges to create our glass and bring back all of our geometry. Here we have the bottom window, and when we open our window we have some geometry inside. Now we need to add some thickness to the bottom frame. When we raise our window, all we see is a single edge. So let's go ahead and double click on an edge to select the entire edge loop and extrude that edge to create the thickness for the window border. This is looking good. Let's go ahead and delete history, change our grid spacing back to 10, and under custom polygon display, turn everything back to border edges, and back face column turned on. We now have our small and single window.